I work as a warehouse manager. How to survive the night shift. Posted by user, not necessarily. I work as a warehouse manager in a warehouse that is around the edge of town. It's an old warehouse, but it's been renovated a lot over the years, but its basic foundations remain the same. It's a huge building with lots of room for stock. The building is basically a mass maze of rows and rows of stock. There is one massive entrance for trucks, and that's about it. Towards the side of the building, there are basic smaller rooms, such as the security room, with all the cameras and the toilets. My room is also there, and that's where I usually spend my time. Our warehouse isn't a big one compared to a regular warehouse, and we only have around 40 employees at one time. On the night shift, even less, 25. It's located pretty much next to the woods. I won't bore you with any more details and get straight to the point of me writing this. Our warehouse isn't a normal one. Strange things happen on the night shift. To combat the strange happenings, and for employee safety, we've created rules for the warehouse night shift. I've been working at this warehouse for around 15 years, and believe me when I say, I've seen everything. Rule number 1. At 10 p.m., go to one of the rooms, or if you are in the main room, find somewhere to hide. You will have to stay there until 11 p.m. Do not move out into the open between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. Rule number 2. If you hear crying, do not try to find the source. Rule number 3. If you see a statue while walking around the complex, stare at it and keep on moving. Only stop looking at it when it disappears out of your sight as you walk away. We have many more rules, and each one of them has an unfortunate tale behind them. Let me tell you the story behind rule number 1. It was late May 2005, and I was preparing myself for the long night shift with a cup of coffee. The wind was whistling, and it was lightly raining. I shivered under my thin jacket. I had to work double shifts back then to make ends meet. I was also an employee back then. Andy, a first-timer for the night shift, sat next to me, and we talked about stuff. He was a young man and had gotten married a little over a year ago. Due to his financial difficulties, he eventually started to work the night shift. He talked about his family and how he had to start earning more. I listened and tried to sympathize with him. Soon it was 9 p.m., and we walked to the warehouse to start our work. Our work mostly consisted of organizing the stock for delivery tomorrow and also for security. At around 10 p.m. I heard a scream. I ran around the massive room looking through rows of shelves when I arrived at the source. It was Andy, and he had fallen to the floor. His eyes were wide, and he seemed heavily shaken. He pointed in front of him with a shaky finger. My gaze moved up to where he pointed, and I locked eyes with the thing he was pointing at. It was a guy in a plague doctor costume, classic black cloak covering his whole body. He was also wearing a pristine ceramic mask with a long, sharp beak on its ends. His eyes were a black void. The plague doctor looked me back dead in the eyes and said in a deep voice, "He has the pestilence." I started nervously laughing as fear took control of me. It was just a stupid joke. Suddenly, the plague doctor seemingly pulled a bag out of nowhere from inside his cloak and took out a dangerous-looking tool from it. It looked like a scalpel, but it was rusted. It had reddish stains all over it. I immediately got a feeling of dread in my stomach and backed away. Andy wasn't as lucky and appeared to be frozen in fear. The plague doctor came closer towards Andy. He took more tools out of his bag and started using them on Andy. The bag didn't look like it could carry that many tools. Andy appeared hypnotized, and he didn't move away. I watched, frozen, as the plague doctor mutilated Andy, rearranging his organs and cutting him up. Andy passed out at some point and fell on the floor. The plague doctor finished and stitched him up, and then he looked straight up at me. My muscles suddenly started working again, and I ran for my life. Andy was found walking around in the warehouse after the incident. The police covered it all up, and we were told not to talk about it. Andy was still alive, but he was an empty shell. He did not speak, and his eyes were empty. He walked around and didn't respond to anything. He was moved to some facility out of town after the incident. Ever since then, we have had Rule 1 in our employee manual, and make sure it's enforced at all times. I'm going to go for my shift now. I work as a warehouse manager. How to survive the night shift, Part 2. Posted by user, not necessarily. I work as a warehouse manager in a warehouse on the edge of town. The building has ancient origins, and it's a particularly small warehouse. We are right next to the woods. If you've read my last post, you would know that my warehouse isn't normal. It's plagued by various entities, and our employees must conform to some rules. In my last post, I covered the first rule, and this one, I'll cover the second. Number 2. If you hear crying, do not try to find the source. The story behind this rule is one that haunts me to this day. I'm surprised I lived to tell the tale. It was early December 2005, and I was running late for the shift. It was a particularly chilly night. Small snowflakes fell from the sky. I drove quickly in my car, with the heaters all the way up. I parked inside the parking lot and prepared myself for the cold outside. I tightly wrapped my fuzzy scarf around my neck as I stepped out of the car. I hated these particular night shifts. The warehouse was even colder than outside, and since it was my employee days, I had to work all night. Nowadays, I just monitor everything. I ran up the asphalt to the massive entrance of the warehouse. Most people were already here and had started working. Jim, my old manager back then, scolded me for being late and instructed me to do things. I couldn't be bothered to argue and silently started working. I started walking down one of the aisles to the back of the warehouse to pick some packages. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound. It was the sound of someone crying. The sound wasn't male or female. It somehow unsettled me and made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Some primal instinct deep within me told me to ignore the sound and leave. My manager must have heard it too, because he comes up behind me after a few seconds and asks, "Hear that?" I nod and point towards the direction it's coming from. I signal for him to stop, but he shakes me off and continues going. Suddenly I hear a scream. Jim's scream. I rushed up to where he was, and I saw something that makes my veins turn into ice until this day. The first thing I noticed was that it was tall, over 2 meters. The next thing I noticed were its hands. They were almost the length of its body, and very disproportionate. It looked extremely malnourished, and its ribs were protruding out. It was hairless and extremely white. Its fingers were stained red, and were extremely sharp. I looked up at its face. It had black, sunken eyes that looked like beads. It had slits for a nose, and its head was hairless and white, just like the rest of its body. Its jaw extended abnormally large and hung over its chest. Its mouth looked like a gaping, bloody wound, and the teeth were barely distinguishable from the tissue. I yelped and stepped a couple of steps back. Jim stood frozen at the thing's feet, staring right at its face. The horrifying creature then extended its arms and picked up Jim. Jim didn't even have time to scream before the creature devoured his head in one go. The creature continued its meal and started to eat more and more of his body. Blood spilled everywhere, but the creature continued, freshly staining its hands and face in blood. The creature fed like it hadn't eaten in weeks, and soon it finished the final bits of Jim with a crunch of bones. It then poked out a tongue I never thought it had and licked the floor clean of blood. I ran before the creature could get me. I must have looked like I had totally lost it. I screamed incoherently when I got to the main area and started pointing in the direction of the creature. Everyone looked through the entire warehouse and couldn't find anything. The only evidence of the whole ordeal was a drop of Jim's blood on my work boots. Ever since then, we added the second rule to our list of rules. Anyways, I'm going to go now. My security staff caught something on the camera feed.